They thought I'd always be the poor cousin at their lavish family gatherings, sitting quietly in the corner while they flaunted their wealth. But this year, when the rhythmic thump of rotor blades echoed across the Connecticut sky, every eye turned toward me, and for once, I wasn't the one looking up from the children's table. The helicopter circling overhead wasn't just my ride home, it was 20 years of humiliation finally coming full circle. My name is Emily Carter, and I learned what it meant to be poor at 7 years old, standing in the marble foyer of my uncle's Greenwich mansion wearing a dress from Goodwill that my mother had carefully altered to fit me. The chandelier above sparkled like something from a fairy tale, but I wasn't the princess in this story, I was the charity case. Dad worked as an electrician in Cleveland, Ohio, his hands permanently stained with grease and wire burns that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Mom spent her days surrounded by books as a school librarian, earning just enough to keep us fed and housed in our cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the east side. We weren't destitute, but we lived paycheck to paycheck, clipping coupons and shopping clearance racks while counting every dollar. Then there was Uncle Richard Carter, Dad's older brother who had somehow transformed himself from a working-class kid into a real estate mogul worth tens of millions. His wife Charlotte dripped in designer everything, and their 2 children, Lucas and Madison, attended private schools that cost more per year than my parents made combined. Their Greenwich estate sat on 5 manicured acres, complete with a pool house bigger than our entire apartment. The annual family gatherings were torture sessions disguised as celebrations. I remember my first Christmas there, clutching a homemade gift for Madison while watching her unwrap packages from Tiffany and Cartier. When she opened my carefully crafted friendship bracelet, Charlotte's smile was as thin as paper. "How thoughtful," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Richard, perhaps we should set up a college fund for Emily. God knows she'll need all the help she can get." The adults laughed, but I caught the whispered conversations that followed me through those opulent rooms. Such a shame about Richard's brother. They really should try harder. Those poor children, growing up like that. The phrase charity case seemed to float in the air wherever I went. Uncle Richard never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of our place in the family hierarchy. During one particularly brutal dinner when I was 12, he regaled the table with stories of his latest real estate acquisition while pointedly asking Dad about his little electrical jobs. "You know, if you ever want to learn about real business, I could find you something in maintenance at one of my properties," he offered with a patronizing smile. "It's never too late to improve your situation." Dad's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Mom's hand found mine under the table, squeezing so hard it almost hurt. That night, I heard them fighting in hushed tones through our paper-thin apartment walls. "We don't have to keep going to these things," Mom whispered. "He's my brother," Dad replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "And Emily should know her family." But sitting in those marble halls, wearing hand-me-downs while my cousins paraded in designer clothes, I began to understand that family wasn't just about blood, it was about respect, and we commanded none. The worst part wasn't the obvious slights, it was the subtle cruelty that permeated every interaction. When I scored highest in my class on a math test, Madison would mention her private tutor. When I won a school writing contest, Lucas would casually drop that he was attending a summer program at Yale. Every achievement felt diminished in their shadow. I started making mental notes of every slight, every condescending comment, every time they made my parents feel small. Uncle Richard's smug lectures about making something of yourself, Charlotte's pointed comments about proper breeding, the way they'd discuss vacations to Europe and skiing in Aspen while we sat there planning our annual camping trip to a state park. By the time I turned 13, something had crystallized inside me. I stopped feeling sorry for myself and started getting angry. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that burns out quickly, but the cold, calculating fury that settles in your bones and never leaves. I made a promise to myself that night, writing it in my diary with shaking hands. I will build something they can't ignore. I will make them see me not as the poor relation, but as someone they wish they could be. That promise became my North Star, guiding every decision I made from that moment forward. The shame I felt at those family gatherings became rocket fuel for my ambition. Starting at 12, I threw myself into every opportunity my public school offered, treating each achievement like a building block toward something greater. While Madison took horseback riding lessons and Lucas played lacrosse at his elite prep school, I was grinding through advanced placement classes, debate team, robotics club, and anything else that might earn me scholarship money. My parents watched with a mixture of pride and concern as I transformed from their quiet daughter into an academic machine. I'd wake up at 5:30 every morning to finish homework before school, stay late for extracurricular activities, then come home to study until my eyes burned. Weekends were for part-time jobs, babysitting, lawn mowing, anything that put cash in my college fund. "You're pushing yourself too hard, sweetheart," Mom would say, finding me hunched over calculus problems at midnight. But I couldn't explain the fire that burned inside me without sounding bitter about our family situation. The annual gatherings became my personal report cards. Each year, I'd arrive with new accomplishments tucked under my arm like armor: National Honor Society, Regional Science Fair winner, perfect SAT scores. But Uncle Richard had a talent for diminishing everything I achieved. "Well, public school standards aren't quite the same, are they?" He'd muse when I mentioned making valedictorian. "Lucas here is competing with some of the brightest minds in the country at Groton. Different league entirely." Charlotte would nod sympathetically, as if my hard work was adorable but ultimately meaningless. "It's wonderful that you're trying so hard, dear. Not everyone can have the advantages Lucas and Madison have had." The worst came during Madison's 18th birthday party, a lavish affair held at the country club with a guest list that read like a who's who of Connecticut society. I was 17, wearing my best dress, a navy blue number from Target that I'd saved 3 months to buy. The party was everything I'd expected: ice sculptures, a live band, and gifts that probably cost more than my parents' mortgage payment. I found myself standing alone by the dessert table, watching Madison open yet another expensive present, when Charlotte materialized beside me with that predatory smile I'd learned to fear. "You know, Emily," she said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "it's so important to have realistic expectations about life. Not everyone can have what Madison has, and that's perfectly fine. You'll probably end up as someone's secretary, and there's nothing wrong with that. Honest work and all." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around us, conversations continued, but I felt exposed and humiliated in front of strangers who now saw me exactly as Charlotte intended, as the poor relation who needed to know her place. I managed to smile and nod, but inside, something fundamental shifted. The embarrassment that had driven me for years crystallized into something harder and more focused. That night, I sat in my tiny bedroom and wrote in my journal with shaking hands, "I will build something they can't even imagine. I will create wealth that makes their money look like pocket change. And when I do, I'll remember every single person who made me feel small." School became my obsession. I studied computer science not because I loved it initially, but because I recognized it as the fastest path to the kind of success that would make them choke on their condescension. While my classmates went to parties and football games, I learned programming languages and devoured books about tech entrepreneurs who'd built empires from nothing. My guidance counselor pulled me aside senior year, concerned about my intensity. "Emily, you're accepted to several excellent schools with full scholarships. You can relax a little now." But relaxation felt like surrender. Every moment I wasn't working toward my goal was time wasted, time that could be spent getting further ahead of everyone who'd ever looked down on me. The University of Michigan offered me a full ride in computer science, and I grabbed it without hesitation. The night before I left for college, Dad found me packing my meager belongings into 2 battered suitcases. "You know we're proud of you no matter what happens." "Right," he said quietly. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." I looked at this man who'd worked his fingers to the bone his entire life, who'd endured his brother's condescension with quiet dignity, and I felt my resolve strengthen even more. "I know, Dad," I said, "but I have to prove something to myself." What I didn't tell him was that I'd already started planning my revenge. Not the petty, vindictive kind, but something far more satisfying. I was going to become so successful that people like Uncle Richard and Charlotte would have to pretend they'd always believed in me. As I drove away from Cleveland that August morning, I carried with me years of accumulated slights and a burning determination to transform every moment of shame into fuel for something extraordinary. University of Michigan felt like stepping into a different universe. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued intelligence over trust funds, who measured success by innovation rather than inheritance. My full scholarship covered tuition, but living expenses meant I needed to work a lot. I juggled 3 jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA in computer science. Mornings started at 5:30, serving coffee at the campus cafe. Afternoons were spent monitoring the computer lab, and evenings I worked as a teaching assistant for introductory programming classes. My schedule was brutal, but every exhausting day felt like progress toward something bigger. It was during my sophomore year, pulling an all-nighter in the engineering building, that I met Daniel Ross. He was hunched over a workstation at 2:15 in the morning, surrounded by energy drink cans and crumpled code printouts, muttering at his screen in frustration. "Database security again," I asked, recognizing the familiar look of someone wrestling with cybersecurity protocols. He looked up with bloodshot eyes and the kind of grateful expression reserved for lifelines. "I've been trying to patch this vulnerability for 6 hours. The system keeps finding new ways to exploit the same weakness." I slid into the chair next to him and studied his code. Daniel was brilliant. His programming was elegant and efficient, but he was thinking like a defender when he needed to think like an attacker. Within an hour, we'd identified the core problem and started developing a more adaptive approach. "You're a genius," he said as we watched our solution successfully repel simulated attacks. "Where did you learn to think like a hacker?" "Growing up poor teaches you to find weaknesses in systems," I replied, only half joking. "You learn to look for cracks that others don't see." Daniel came from a background similar to mine. His father was a mechanic in Detroit. His mother cleaned office buildings at night. We understood each other's hunger in ways our wealthier classmates couldn't. While they networked at fraternity parties, we spent weekends in the lab, building something that could change our lives. Our friendship evolved into partnership when we realized we were both obsessed with the same problem. Traditional cybersecurity was too rigid, too reactive. Companies would install expensive systems that worked perfectly until hackers found a new approach. Then everything had to be rebuilt from scratch. "What if we could create something that learns and adapts?" Daniel proposed during one of our marathon coding sessions. "Something that doesn't just block known threats but evolves to handle new ones." The idea consumed us. We started developing an AI-driven security system that could analyze attack patterns in real time and modify its defenses accordingly. It was ambitious beyond anything attempted in academia, but we had something most researchers lacked: desperation. My family's reaction to my college success was predictably dismissive. During Christmas break my junior year, Uncle Richard cornered me at the annual gathering with his trademark condescending smile. "Still playing with computers. I see," he said, swirling his brandy. "Madison just got accepted to Columbia's MBA program. Real business education. You know, perhaps you should consider switching to something more practical." "Actually, Daniel and I are working on launching our own company," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Richard's laugh was sharp and brief. "Ah, yes, the classic college startup fantasy. How many bright kids think they're going to be the next Google? Most of these little ventures die within a year. Emily, maybe you should focus on getting a solid job at an established company instead of chasing pipe dreams." Charlotte nodded sympathetically. "It's so easy to get caught up in unrealistic expectations. Perhaps Richard could find you an entry-level position at one of his firms when you graduate. Something stable." I smiled and thanked them, but internally I was cataloging another entry in my growing list of people who would eat their words. That night, I called Daniel from my childhood bedroom. "They think we're playing house with computers," I told him. "Uncle Richard basically patted me on the head and told me to get a real job." "Good," Daniel replied. "Let them underestimate us. It'll make the victory that much sweeter." Senior year became a blur of classes, jobs, and 18-hour days developing our security platform. We lived on instant ramen and determination, coding in my cramped apartment until our eyes burned. The rejection letters from potential investors piled up 23 consecutive no's from venture capital firms who couldn't see past our age and lack of corporate connections. "Maybe we should wait," Daniel suggested after our latest rejection. "Get some experience at established companies, build our resumes." "No," I said firmly. "We're not waiting for permission to succeed. We're not going to let anyone else control our timeline." The breakthrough came during finals week of our senior year. I was debugging our adaptive algorithm at 3:45 in the morning when something clicked. The code I'd been wrestling with for months suddenly made perfect sense, and I saw how to make our system not just reactive but predictive. I called Daniel immediately, not caring about the hour. "I figured it out," I said breathlessly. "The algorithm doesn't just adapt to attacks, it anticipates them. It learns from partial patterns and predicts the most likely next moves." We spent the next 72 hours straight perfecting the breakthrough, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. When we finally tested it against the most sophisticated attack simulations we could design, our system didn't just defend, it evolved, learning from each assault and becoming stronger. "This is it," Daniel said, staring at the test results. "This is going to change everything." I thought about Uncle Richard's dismissive laughter, about Charlotte's condescending advice, about every person who'd ever made me feel small because of my bank account. "No," I corrected him. "This is going to change us. Everything else is just bonus." Graduation was 3 weeks away, but I already knew I wouldn't be looking for a traditional job. We were going to build something that would make all those years of humiliation worth it. The summer after graduation was a masterclass in rejection and ramen noodles. Daniel and I rented a cramped studio apartment in Ann Arbor for $400 a month, splitting the cost and sleeping in shifts so we could work around the clock. Our office was a card table from Goodwill, 2 folding chairs, and a collection of second-hand computers that Daniel had rebuilt from spare parts. We pitched our adaptive cybersecurity platform to anyone who would listen. Venture capitalists looked at us like we were selling snake oil. "Too theoretical," they said. "Unproven technology. Come back when you have real-world applications and revenue." The phrase, "college kids with big dreams," followed us everywhere. The worst meeting was with Meridian Capital, a firm Uncle Richard had name-dropped at family gatherings. I'd managed to get us a 15-minute slot through a connection of a connection, and I walked in there thinking maybe family ties would open doors. "Interesting concept," the lead partner said after our presentation. "But cybersecurity is a mature market. The big players have it locked down. You'd need millions in backing just to compete, and frankly, you don't have the experience or connections to attract that kind of investment." He slid our business plan back across the polished conference table. "My advice, take your impressive resumes and apply to Microsoft or IBM. Get some real experience under your belts." The rejection stung, but what happened next was worse. 2 days later, Uncle Richard called. "Emily, I heard through the grapevine that you're still pursuing this startup nonsense," he said, his voice oozing false concern. "Look, I respect your ambition, but you're embarrassing yourself. Charlotte knows someone at a respectable accounting firm in Cleveland. Entry level. But it's real work with real benefits. Sometimes we have to set aside our fantasies and join the adult world." I hung up on him the first time I'd ever been openly defiant and immediately called Daniel. "They think we're children playing dress-up," I said, pacing our tiny apartment. "Every single person who matters thinks we're going to fail." "Then we prove them wrong." Daniel replied simply, "We find someone who believes in the technology, not our pedigree." That someone turned out to be Marcus Webb, Chief Technology Officer at Hartfield Financial Services, a mid-sized firm handling investments for regional banks. Marcus was a former startup founder himself who'd sold his company to a larger corporation and stayed on as an executive. Unlike the venture capitalists, he understood our technology immediately. "This is exactly what we need," he said after our demonstration. "We've been hit by 3 different cyber attacks this year. Our current security system is like trying to stop a moving car with a brick wall. It works until someone finds a way around it." The contract was smaller than we'd hoped, $200,000 for a year-long pilot program, but it was real money from a real company with real problems. More importantly, it gave us credibility and a chance to prove our system worked in the wild. We moved our operation to a slightly less cramped apartment and hired our first employee, Sarah Kim, a brilliant programmer we'd known from university who was willing to work for equity and the promise of stock options. The 3 of us worked 16-hour days, fine-tuning our algorithms and watching our system learn from every attempted breach Hartfield faced. The breakthrough came 6 months into the contract. A sophisticated ransomware attack targeted Hartfield's client database, the kind of assault that would have crippled their old security system. Instead, our adaptive platform recognized the attack pattern, traced its methodology, and not only blocked it but created countermeasures for 17 related attack vectors. "Your system didn't just stop them," Marcus told us in our follow-up meeting. "It made us stronger. The attempted breach actually improved our defenses." Word spread through the financial services community faster than we'd dared hope. Companies that had never heard of Carter Ross Cyber Defense, yes, we'd named it after ourselves, much to the amusement of our critics, were suddenly calling for demonstrations. Our second major client was Metropolitan Bank, with a contract worth $800,000. The third was Alliance Insurance, for $1.2 million. By the end of our second year, we had 12 employees and were protecting the digital assets of companies worth billions. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Uncle Richard was bragging about his latest real estate acquisitions at family gatherings, I was quietly building a company that would soon be worth more than his entire portfolio. But I kept our success under wraps, showing up to family events in the same modest clothes and old car, letting everyone assume my little computer company was barely surviving. "Still playing with that startup?" Charlotte asked at Madison's college graduation party. "How quaint. Madison's already been offered a position at Goldman Sachs. You know, real corporate success." I smiled and nodded, thinking about the acquisition offer we'd received the week before, $25 million from a major tech corporation for our entire company. Daniel and I had turned it down without hesitation. We weren't building Carter Ross to sell it to the highest bidder. We were building it to become something that couldn't be bought. "Small companies can be so fulfilling," I replied to Charlotte, knowing that within 5 years, our small company would be protecting more financial data than Goldman Sachs handled. That night, I stood on our office balcony. We'd moved to a real office space with actual employees and everything, and thought about how far we'd come from that card table in Ann Arbor. But this was just the beginning. Every condescending comment, every dismissive laugh, every person who'd treated me like a charity case was going to witness what happened when you underestimated someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The best part was that none of them saw it coming. Year 3 was when everything exploded. Our adaptive cybersecurity platform had proven itself so effective that companies started poaching our clients' security teams just to understand how we did it. When Fortress Industries, one of the largest defense contractors in the country, called requesting a meeting, I knew we'd crossed into a different league entirely. "Ms. Carter, your system prevented what could have been a catastrophic breach of classified information," their security director explained during our presentation. "We need this technology protecting our most sensitive projects. Name your price." The contract was worth $8 million over 2 years. More importantly, it opened doors to government agencies and Fortune 500 companies that had never considered working with a startup. Within 6 months, we were protecting data for companies whose names I'd only seen in business magazines. Daniel and I had to make a crucial decision: scale rapidly or risk losing market share to larger competitors who were starting to notice our success. We chose growth, hiring aggressively and expanding our operations to a 12,000 square foot facility in downtown Detroit. Our team grew from 12 employees to 60 in 8 months. The stress was incredible. I was working 18-hour days, Managing everything from product development to client relations to investor meetings, we'd raised $30 million in Series A funding, giving us the capital to compete with established cybersecurity giants. But the pressure to deliver results was crushing. It was during this chaotic period that I discovered helicopter flying. One of our clients, a tech executive in California, mentioned that he commuted to work via helicopter to avoid traffic. The idea fascinated me, the ultimate symbol of efficiency and freedom. I started taking lessons at a flight school outside Detroit, spending Saturday mornings learning to pilot a Robinson R-44. Flying became my escape from the intensity of building the company. Up there, alone with the controls and the horizon, I could think clearly about strategy and vision without the constant interruptions of emails and meetings. My instructor, a former military pilot named Jack Morrison, noticed my natural aptitude for complex maneuvers. You've got instincts for this," he told me after a particularly challenging cross-country flight. "Most executives who take lessons want to fly straight lines. You understand that sometimes you need to navigate around obstacles to reach your destination." The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Everything I'd accomplished had been about finding alternative routes around the barriers that traditional paths presented. While other entrepreneurs relied on family connections and Ivy League networks, I'd built success through pure technical innovation and relentless execution. By year 4, Carter Ross Cyber Defense was being courted by acquisition-hungry corporations offering increasingly absurd amounts of money. The largest offer came from Titan Technologies' $400 million for complete ownership. Daniel and I met in our conference room at 11:30 on a Tuesday night to discuss it. "We could take the money and start something new," he suggested, exhaustion evident in his voice. $400 million would set us up for life." I stared out the window at the Detroit skyline, thinking about Uncle Richard's real estate empire and Charlotte's condescending advice about realistic expectations. "No," I said firmly. "We're not selling. We're going to build something bigger than anything they can imagine." "Emily, we're already successful beyond our wildest dreams. What more do you want?" What I wanted was simple. I wanted to become so powerful that people like my uncle would have to acknowledge not just my success, but my superiority. I wanted to build wealth that made their inherited advantages look like pocket change. "I want them to regret every time they made me feel small," I admitted. "I want to become too big to ignore." We turned down Titan's offer and doubled down on expansion. By year 5, we had offices in 6 cities and were protecting data for 43 of the Fortune 100 companies. Our valuation had reached $1.2 billion, officially making us a unicorn startup. The business press started taking notice. Forbes ran a feature titled "The Billionaire You've Never Heard of," profiling my journey from small-town scholarship student to tech mogul. Fortune included me in their 40 under 40 list. Harvard Business School invited me to speak about adaptive technology and market disruption. But I kept my success largely hidden from my family. At gatherings, I still drove my old Honda Civic and wore clothes from Target. When relatives asked about my computer business, I'd vaguely mention that we were doing okay and change the subject. Let them think I was barely scraping by while Madison climbed the corporate ladder at her investment firm and Lucas established his law practice. The helicopter lessons had evolved into ownership. I purchased a used Augusta Westland AW109, having it refurbished to executive standards. Flying had become more than recreation. It was practical transportation for client meetings across the Midwest and East Coast. More than that, it was a symbol of the freedom that came with building something from nothing. My parents knew more about my success than the extended family, but even they didn't grasp the full scope of what I'd built. Dad was proud that his daughter owned a successful computer company, but when I tried to explain that Carter Ross was worth over $1 billion, he'd just smile and nod like I was speaking a foreign language. "Just remember to stay humble, sweetheart," Mom would say. "Money changes people." She didn't understand that money hadn't changed me. It had revealed who I'd always been underneath the shame and silence. Every contract we signed, every client we protected, every breakthrough our team achieved was another step away from the girl who'd been dismissed as a charity case. The annual family gathering was approaching, and for the first time in my life, I was looking forward to it, not because I expected warmth or acceptance, but because I was finally ready to show them exactly what the poor cousin had been building while they weren't paying attention. This year would be different. This year, they would see me coming. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing, just like every year. The Carter family annual summer gathering, it announced in elegant script, followed by the familiar Greenwich address that had haunted my childhood memories. This year's theme was Celebrating Success, which felt like the universe's idea of a cosmic joke. I drove up from New York in my Honda Civic, the same modest car I'd been driving to these events for years. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from Fortune 500 CEOs and government officials, but I let them go to voicemail. Today was about something more important than quarterly earnings reports. Uncle Richard's estate looked exactly as I remembered manicured lawns that probably cost more to maintain than most people's salaries. The circular driveway lined with luxury vehicles that read like a catalog of automotive excess. BMWs, Mercedes, a Porsche, and Richard's pride and joy, a cherry red Ferrari that he'd bought to celebrate his latest real estate acquisition. I parked my Honda between a Lexus and an Audi, watching through my rearview mirror as arriving relatives gave my car the kind of look usually reserved for roadkill. Perfect. Let them assume I was still struggling while they flaunted their inherited wealth. The party was already in full swing when I entered through the marble foyer that had intimidated me as a child. Nothing had changed: the same ostentatious chandelier, the same oil paintings of hunting scenes, the same atmosphere of calculated superiority that pervaded every surface. Emily. Charlotte's voice cut through the ambient chatter like nails on a chalkboard. She glided over in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's rent, her smile as artificial as everything else about her. How wonderful that you could make it. We were just talking about you. I'll bet you were, I thought, but smiled warmly. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Aunt Charlotte, you look stunning as always. She preened at the compliment, then leaned in conspiratorially. Richard has some exciting news about a new development in Westport. $50 million in projected revenue. It's so impressive what real success looks like. Don't you think? Absolutely, I agreed, thinking about the $120 million contract we'd signed with the Department of Defense just last week. Real success is definitely impressive. The dining room buzzed with the familiar symphony of competitive bragging disguised as family conversation. Lucas was holding court near the bar, regaling anyone within earshot about his recent partnership at his law firm. Madison, now working at Goldman Sachs, was describing her latest acquisition deal with the kind of detailed smugness that made my teeth ache. And the commission alone was more than most people make in 3 years, she concluded, shooting me a meaningful look. Of course, not everyone can work in high finance. The intellectual demands are quite intense. I nodded thoughtfully. I imagine they are. Technical fields can be so challenging when you're not used to complex problem solving. Uncle Richard appeared at my elbow, whiskey in hand, and that familiar, patronizing smile plastered across his face. He'd aged in the 5 years since I'd seen him last. His hair was grayer, his waistline thicker, but his condescension remained as sharp as ever. Emily, still tinkering with that little computer company of yours? He asked loudly enough for nearby conversations to pause. I keep hearing about all these tech bubbles bursting. Such a volatile industry. Have you considered something more stable? Charlotte mentioned that her friend owns a very successful accounting firm. The room had gone quiet. All attention focused on Uncle Richard's latest performance of familial concern. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, not just for 5 years, but for 25 years of accumulated slights and condescension. Actually, Uncle Richard, the company's doing quite well, I said calmly. We just passed the $2 billion valuation mark last quarter. Richard's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Oh, Emily, valuation isn't the same as actual money. Any startup can claim ridiculous numbers on paper. What matters is real assets, real revenue, real profit. Charlotte nodded sagely. Exactly. Madison's bonus alone this year was more than most small companies see in revenue. When you work for established institutions, you understand the difference between fantasy and reality. I felt that familiar burning sensation in my chest, the same feeling I'd had as a child watching them dismiss my achievements, my dreams, my worth. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't the powerless little girl in the second-hand dress. You're absolutely right, I said, pulling out my phone. Real assets matter most. I typed a quick message, now. What are you doing? Lucas asked, clearly confused by my sudden shift in demeanor. Just arranging my ride home, I replied, slipping the phone back into my pocket. I have a helicopter waiting. The room erupted in laughter. Uncle Richard slapped his knee. Charlotte covered her mouth with exaggerated politeness, and even the cousins exchanged amused glances. A helicopter? Richard wheezed between chuckles. Oh, that's rich. Did you rent it for the afternoon to impress us, Emily? We appreciate the effort, but you don't need to pretend to be something you're not. Still playing make-believe, Madison added with a smirk. Some people never grow out of their fantasy phase. I stood there, absorbing their mockery with the patience of someone who knew exactly what was coming next. In the distance, I could hear the faint sound of rotor blades cutting through the summer air. You know what, Uncle Richard? I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly attentive room. You're absolutely right about the difference between fantasy and reality. Should we step outside and discuss it? The sound started as a distant whisper, barely audible over the chatter and clinking glasses. But within seconds, it grew into the unmistakable rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors cutting through the Connecticut afternoon air. Conversations began to falter as heads turned toward the expansive windows overlooking the back lawn. What on earth? Charlotte began, but her words were drowned out by the increasing roar of the approaching aircraft. Uncle Richard's face had gone from amused to confused to something approaching concern as the sound grew louder. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, we could all see my Augusta Westland AW109 appearing over the tree line, its sleek white fuselage gleaming in the summer sun as it descended toward the manicured lawn. Emily, Richard said slowly, his voice barely audible over the noise. What exactly is going on here? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I watched the faces around me transform from smugness to bewilderment to something that looked suspiciously like fear. Madison's mouth had fallen open. Lucas had gone pale. Charlotte was gripping her pearls so tightly I thought the strand might snap. The helicopter touched down with professional precision on the expansive lawn, its rotors creating a windstorm that sent napkins and tablecloths flying throughout the outdoor seating area. Several guests had pressed themselves against the windows, staring in disbelief at the executive aircraft that had just landed in their midst. Captain Williams, my pilot, shut down the engines and stepped out of the cockpit with military precision. He was dressed in his standard uniform crisp white shirt, navy blazer, captain's bars gleaming on his shoulders. He surveyed the shocked faces pressed against the windows, then walked purposefully toward the house. The butler, looking more flustered than I'd ever seen him, hurried to the front door. I could hear muffled conversation, then footsteps approaching the dining room. "Excuse me," the butler announced, his voice shaking slightly. "There's a Captain Williams here requesting Miss Emily Carter." The room had gone completely silent except for the gradually fading whine of the helicopter's cooling engines. Every eye was fixed on me as I calmly set down my water glass and smoothed my simple dress. "That would be me," I said, standing with the kind of composure that comes from years of boardroom negotiations with Fortune 500 executives. Captain Williams appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate respect. "Miss Carter, your aircraft is ready for departure when you are." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear Uncle Richard's grandfather clock ticking in the next room. I looked around at the sea of stunned faces, these people who had spent decades making me feel small, who had dismissed my dreams and mocked my ambitions. "Actually, Captain Williams, I think I'll be a few more minutes. Would you mind waiting by the aircraft? Of course, Miss Carter. He nodded professionally and withdrew, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly looked like they'd seen a ghost. Uncle Richard was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Emily, that's actually your helicopter. Yes, I replied simply, though it's just one of them. The larger one was already booked for a client meeting in Washington tomorrow. Charlotte made a sound that might have been a whimper. Madison's face had gone through several shades of red and was now settling into a sickly pale yellow. But how? Lucas began, then seemed to run out of words. I smiled at him, the same patient smile Charlotte had always given me when explaining why my dreams were unrealistic. How can I afford a helicopter? Well, Lucas, when your cybersecurity company protects the digital infrastructure for 68% of Fortune 100 companies, the economics work out quite favorably. The room erupted in whispered conversations and shocked exclamations, but I held up my hand for silence. Uncle Richard, you asked about real assets versus fantasy numbers. Carter Ross Cyber Defense was valued at $2.3 billion as of last Friday's board meeting. Our annual revenue is currently running at $420 million. We employ over 300 people across 8 offices. We hold exclusive contracts with the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and approximately 200 major corporations. Richard's whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. But he stammered. That's not possible. You were. Poor, I finished for him. Yes, I was. And every single time you reminded me of that fact, every time you made my parents feel small, every time you suggested I should lower my expectations and accept my place, you were building something much more valuable than my company. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the room. You were building my motivation. Charlotte had sunk into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Madison looked like she might be physically ill. The other relatives and guests stood frozen, witnessing the complete inversion of everything they thought they knew about family hierarchies and success. The beautiful irony, I continued, my voice carrying easily through the stunned silence, is that last month, Carter Ross acquired controlling interest in Meridian Real Estate Holdings, which, if I'm not mistaken, includes about 60% of your commercial portfolio. Uncle Richard. The color drained from Richard's face so completely I thought he might faint. Which means, I said, checking my watch, technically, you work for me now. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Uncle Richard's face cycled through expressions I'd never seen before: shock, disbelief, fear, and finally, a dawning comprehension of just how completely the tables had turned. That's impossible, he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Meridian Real Estate. That's a privately held company. They don't sell to outsiders. They do when the offer is substantial enough, I replied calmly. $750 million tends to open doors that family connections can't. Your friend Harrison Meridian was quite eager to retire to his estate in the Hamptons once we presented our acquisition proposal. Charlotte looked up from her hands, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Emily, I don't understand. If your company is so successful, why didn't you ever tell us? I considered the question, thinking back to all those years of silent humiliation, of biting my tongue while they dismissed my dreams and belittled my family. Because, Aunt Charlotte, you never asked. You never once inquired about my work beyond calling it playing with computers. You were too busy explaining why my aspirations were unrealistic to notice when those aspirations became reality. I walked slowly around the room, meeting each pair of eyes that had looked down on me for so many years. Madison, you mentioned that intellectual demands in finance are quite intense. You're right. That's why I hired 3 former Goldman Sachs executives to manage Carter Ross's investment portfolio. They tell me the complexity of cybersecurity innovation makes traditional finance look quaint by comparison. Madison's face had gone from pale to green. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Lucas, your law firm does excellent work. In fact, we've been using your competitor, Williams and Associates, for our legal needs. They handle billion-dollar acquisitions with more expertise than most boutique firms can offer. I stopped in front of Uncle Richard, the man who had spent 25 years making me feel worthless. And, Uncle Richard, you taught me the most valuable lesson of all. You showed me that respect isn't inherited, it's earned. You can't buy it with real estate holdings or country club memberships. You earn it by building something that matters, by creating value that others can't ignore. Richard's hands were shaking as he set down his empty glass. Emily, we never meant... Yes, you did, I interrupted, my voice sharp for the first time all evening. You meant every condescending comment, every dismissive laugh, every time you made my parents feel ashamed of their honest work. You meant to keep me in my place because it made you feel superior. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Through the windows, I could see Captain Williams standing patiently beside the helicopter, checking his watch. But here's what you never understood, I continued, my voice softening slightly. Poor doesn't mean powerless. It just means you have to work harder, think smarter, and want it more than anyone who's had everything handed to them. I looked around the room one final time, taking in the faces of people who would never see me the same way again. I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need your acceptance or your charity or your condescending advice about realistic expectations. What I built, what Daniel and I built, we built it because we refused to accept the limitations you tried to place on us. I walked toward the door, then paused. By the way, Uncle Richard, the Meridian acquisition comes with an interesting clause. All existing property management contracts are subject to review and renegotiation. I'll have my people contact your people about new terms for your commercial leases. I'm sure we can work something out that's mutually beneficial. His face went ashen as the full implications hit him. Oh, and one more thing, I added, pulling out my business card, the simple white card that read, Emily Carter, CEO, Carter Ross Cyber Defense, and placing it on the marble table. When people ask you about your niece Emily, the one who used to be poor, you can tell them she's the one who owns your buildings now. I walked outside into the Connecticut sunshine, where Captain Williams was waiting with professional patience. The helicopter's rotors began their slow spin-up as I approached. Ready for departure, Miss Carter. More than ready, Captain. As we lifted off from Uncle Richard's perfect lawn, I looked down at the house that had once seemed so imposing, so unreachable. From this height, it looked small and ordinary, just another expensive house filled with people who had confused wealth with worth. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Board meeting moved to 4:30. Pentagon contract officially signed. We did it. I smiled, watching the Connecticut countryside spread out below us as we climbed toward cruising altitude. We had done it. We'd built something that no one could take away, something that proved worth wasn't determined by where you started, but by how far you were willing to go. The little girl in the second-hand dress was finally flying. Thank you so much for listening to Emily's revenge story. I'd love to hear from you. Comment below and let me know where you're listening to this from and what you thought about Emily's journey from the poor cousin to tech billionaire. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about whether Emily's revenge was satisfying or if you think she went too far. Your engagement means the world to me.